So in this video, we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, Lesson 9. Chapter 3, Lesson 9 goes back to the coordinate plane that we've been working on for the past couple of lessons. We're going to be finding distances now on a coordinate plane. So we'll plot a couple of distances, figure out if they cross an axis or if they stay on the same side of an axis, figure out what math that involves, and be able to find an answer. Now, I've stressed since the very beginning of school, the two most important things on any lesson that we're doing is that you follow along and you take your notes that you're supposed to. So keep up in your book. This first introduction set of questions, follow along, fill it in. That way you have something to go back to. The other aspect is to make sure that you're listening. If you start daydreaming, thinking about something else, or you just didn't quite understand what it was that I meant from what I said, then you need a pause and go back and rewind. Because listening doesn't just mean that you hear it, but it is the process of what you do with it in between those two ears. Thinking about it and understanding it. So keep up or follow along as we go through this introduction, and then we'll get into some practice problems. So first we're just going to look at everything that we're told in number 1. We're going to reason through it, and then we'll fill in the information below to make sure that our reasoning was indeed logical. So I have a map. It shows me that I'm talking about Foggy Mountain Park. I have this eagle nest over here, and then I'm going to talk about some camps. This question says that the map of Foggy Mountain Park is marked on a coordinate plane in units of 1 mile. There are 2 campgrounds in the park. Camp 1 is located at a -4, +3. Camp 2 is located at a +5, +3. How far is it from Camp 1 to Camp 2? So when I'm plotting, once again, I think about my coordinate plane. I remember that my first number is my x-axis. It tells me that I either run forward because it's a positive number, or I run backwards because it's a negative number. And then my second number in my ordered pair is my y-axis, and it tells me to either jump up because it's positive, or to jump down because it's negative. So when I look at my ordered pair then and I want to plot them, then I'm also going to realize that I have 2 numbers that are the same. And on my y-axis, I have a +3. Well, what does that tell me? That would tell me that they're both on a straight line. That I'll go forward and I'll go backwards, but a +3, they're both going to be at the same height on my map. That'll make it easier when I go to do my math, because they're going to be straight across from one another. So then I want to work on plotting them. My ordered pair then tells me to go backwards 4 because it's a negative, so I always run backwards when it's a negative, and then I jump up to the 3. And then my second one tells me to run forward 5 because it's a +5, and then also jump up 3. So indeed when I plot them, I see that these 2 are on a straight line, and they cross this center axis, the y-axis. So I'm looking at a distance of a -4 because I went backwards and I went positive. But when I'm talking about an overall distance, then I have to remember that I'm talking about an absolute value. An absolute value, once again, is whatever number is on the inside of the box is always positive. What it means is how many steps did I take from 0 to get to this number. So if I'm talking about an absolute value of -4, then I'm just talking about 4. And my absolute value of +5 is just 5. So my overall distance, how far did I travel? Well, then I would have to add those together, and I would get 9 miles. So let's look at the questions in the way that they're lined up down below. It says, first find the distance between the x-coordinates of point blank and point 03. Find the distance between the x-coordinates. So I'm talking about going from my -4, 3 to my 0, 3, and that distance has to be the absolute value of that number. If I go from 0 to -4 and I'm talking about my absolute value, then I am indeed talking about just 4 miles. When I look at the second one, then it says to find that distance for Camp 2, and then my x-coordinate was 5, 3, and going all the way over to 0, 3, because that's going to be my distance. And when I'm talking about how far I went, once again, I'm talking about an absolute value. And a positive 5 is just going to be my 5 miles. So when I talk about my total distance, well, I have to take my 4 miles that I had and my 5 miles that I had and add them together, and I get 9 miles. So my answer is indeed 9 miles for my reasoning. So when I think about what we're talking about, we're working through the processes of figuring out the distance between two areas. So in that example then, we're talking about 2 points on a coordinate plane, and that they are on the opposite sides of an axis. And when they're on the opposite sides of an axis, then that means I'm going to find their absolute values, and I'm going to add them together. Okay, so when I talk about it and I think about it, then I have to realize if I've got it or not. But maybe someone stopped and thought, with the italicized information that I said, what if they're on the same side? And that's a good question, and we need to understand that. So if I'm talking about the same side, then I'm talking about, well, let's, for example, negative 10, 1 and negative 2, 1. If they're on the same side, then I still have to go through the same steps, the same processes. Realizing that once again, I have the same y-axis. So I'm going forwards or backwards a different distance, but I'm still at the same height. So I'm still on a straight line. So that makes my math easier on these type of problems. But I'm still talking about figuring out what my absolute value is of those x's before I can do any math. So when I talk about the absolute value of negative 10, the absolute value of negative 2, then I remember once again, absolute values are just the number in positive form. They mean how many steps is it from 0 to that number. So I'm talking about a 10 and I'm talking about a 2. Then when I'm talking about this distance, they're on the same side. So if I'm talking about a distance that's on the same side, then I have to subtract, because it's not an additional distance on the opposite side. So my 10 minus 2 is just going to give me 8 units. So when I'm working through it, I'm thinking then, okay, so keep in mind that on the opposite sides, I have to add, and if they're on the same side, I have to subtract. That's going to help me solve these problems. So we're going to go through the examples. Remember, keep up, follow along, take the notes so you can learn what we're doing. So when I'm introduced to this, I have this coordinate plane and I have several different plots. It says, find the distance between the pair of points on the coordinate plane for points A and B. So for A and B, we're talking about these two right here. Alright, so look at the coordinates of the points. The blank coordinates of the points are the same. Well, when I look at that, they're both in quadrant 3 because they're both negative negatives. And what is the same between them with these 2 points? Well, the y is the same. So I know that the y coordinates are the same points indeed. For part B then, it says to find the distances of A and B. So the distances of A and B, it tells me that I have a distance of A that is negative 9. So a negative 9 absolute value, because once again we're talking about having to know the distance from point 1 to point 2. Once again, absolute value just means how far am I walking from 0. If I'm going forward, it's a positive number. If I'm going backwards, it's a positive number, but I'm walking. So it's always just a positive number that I write down as the answer to an absolute value. So my absolute value of negative 9 for point A is just going to be 9. And then when I look at my x-axis point for B, it's a negative 4. So my absolute value for negative 4 is just going to be 4. Because I went a distance of 4 steps. So then 3 takes me to answering the question down at the bottom. Now I'm going to subtract to find the distance. Why am I subtracting? Because they're on the same side. So I'm going to subtract to find that distance. Excuse me. So I have my 9, and I'm going to subtract my 4. And when I have 9 minus 4, basic math, I know I have 5. So on this one then, instead of a horizontal line, I'm working with a vertical line. So if we just say, well, that's going to be my y-axis, I'm going to be staying on the y-axis, so I'm not going to have an x. I'm not going to go forward or backwards. It says to look at the coordinates of the points. So we're looking at D and C. It would be a 0, 3 and a 0, 10. It says the blank coordinates of the points are the same. So when I look at it, it would have a 0, 3, and I would have a 0, 10, because I'm staying on the y-axis. So my x coordinates of the points are the same. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to jump up on both of them. Find the distances of C and D from 0 on your vertical line then, going up. So my distance for C is my 10. So I have an absolute value of positive 10, which tells me that I have just 10 units. And for my distance of D then, I'm only going up 3 this time. So I'm going to go an absolute value of positive 3, which is just 3. So once again, when I'm looking at it, they're both up above. They're both a positive, so that would be my quadrant 1. If they're on the same side, then I'm going to have to subtract. So I would take my 10, and I would minus 3, and I would see that they are at a distance of 7 units. So they are at a distance of 7 units when I'm talking about the distance between C and D. So you get the idea? It's very simple steps going through these. First, I just have to figure out which axis that they're over, because if they cross an axis, then I know I'm going to do one type of math. If they're on the same side of an axis, then I'm going to do the other type of math. So if they're going to cross or be on opposite sides, then I know I'm going to add. And if they are on the same side, then I know every time I'm going to subtract. So are we ready for the math? Got some practice problems we're going to work. So on our practice problems, we start with this here. So the distance, find the distance between the pairs of the points. The first one that I have is going to be working with -3, +1, +2, +1. So I'm going to use these two right here. So when I'm looking at them and I see that they have a horizontal distance from each other, I notice that my y-axis is the same. I can see that they are on opposite sides of one another. So when I go through plotting their information, then I have my -3, 1. So how many steps did I take? Well, I went -3, so my absolute value is going to be 3. Well, if I go to my second one, which is a +2, 1, then I went forward 2 steps, which is a total of 2. They're a distance that are on opposite sides of an axis, so I know that I'm going to add them together. 3 plus 2 gives me a total of 5 units. So on number 2 then, on number 2 I'm going to be dealing with +2, +1, and a +2, -4. Straight line again vertically. Notice that they are going to cross the x-axis, so they are going to be on opposite sides, so I know that I'm going to have to add. So my x's stay the same. My y's, therefore, are the math that I'm going to be working with. I know I have to find my absolute values. So my absolute values of +1 is 1. My absolute value of -4 is 4. When I look at them and they're on opposite sides, then I know opposite sides tell me to add. 1 plus 4 does equal 5. When I look at 3 then, I'm going to be looking at these two down here. Once again, that's my quadrant 4 because they're positive negatives. Excuse me. My y's stay the same. So if my y's stay the same, then I'm looking at using my x-axis to do the math. So I have to find my absolute value of positive 2, which is just 2, and my absolute value of positive 4, which is just 4. And once again, they're on the same side of the axis. And if they're on the same side, then I would have to subtract. But I can't do that, can I? Can I take 2 from 4 or 4 from 2? Which one works? Well, I'm just going to switch them around, and I'm going to have my 4 minus 2. It doesn't matter which order those are in because I'm just finding the distance between the 2 points. So I would indeed have 2 units. On the last one then, we're talking about these 2 points up here. Once again, they're in the same quadrant. They're both negative positives, so that's going to be my quadrant 2. That tells me what type of math I'm going to be doing at the end. I look at my numbers and I see which one's the same, and I should notice that well, my x's are the same, so I know I'm going to use my y's to figure my math. So I'm going to find my absolute value of 3, which is 3. I'm going to find my absolute value of 1, which is 1. They're on the same side of the axis, so I know that the same tells me to subtract, and 3 minus 1 is 2 units. Pretty simple? I'm hoping so. It should be. So we're going to go through these last ones then. Now, on your book, it doesn't give you a coordinate plane, but you can look back at your book at any time that you want if it helps you more to count your steps, forward, backwards, up, down, to do your X and your Y. Always remember that as we're doing these, we're going to do a couple different things. First thing we're going to do is locate which one's changing, so we figure out which axis is the same. The ones that aren't the same is the one that changes. I will find the absolute value of those, and then if they're on opposite sides, then I know that I'm going to add, and if they're on the same side, then I know that I will subtract. So my y's or my x's stay the same. My y's are the ones that are changing, so I'm going to do my absolute values. So maybe you're wondering, well, how, if I look at that, how will I know if they're on the same side of the axis or not? Well, it's really easy. Are they going to be a positive and a positive, a negative and a negative? If they are, then they're the same side, and I'm going to subtract. Or if one is a positive and one is a negative, those are opposite sides, so that's when I add. In this case, I have the absolute value of 5, which is 5, and the absolute value of negative 5, which is 5. So when I look at those original signs, they are indeed opposite, so that's why I'm going to add. And 5 plus 5 just gives me 10. On number 6, the one that stays the same is also my x-axis. So my y is the one that I change and do the math with. My absolute value of positive 1 is 1, and my absolute value of negative 3 is just 3. Once again, the original numbers, there's a positive and a negative, opposite signs, so it has to be on the opposite side, and opposites tell me to add. 1 plus 3 gives me 4. For number 7 then, once again, I have my x-axis that is the same. So my y's are what I'm going to do the math with. So on my y's, I have a negative 5. I have to find its absolute value. Negative 5's absolute value is 5. And then I find the absolute value of negative 1, and its absolute value is just 1. The difference on this one is They're both negative. So I know that they're both on the same side. And same sides tell me to subtract. So 5 minus 1 gives me 4. So when I go to 8 then, 8 gives me a negative 7, positive 3, and a positive 5, positive 3. I look for the one that stays the same, and this time I now have my y-axis that stays the same. So I'm going to be doing my math with my x-axis. So I have a negative 7 for my first x-axis, absolute value of negative 7, 7. And then I have a positive 5, and its absolute value is 5. 1 is a negative, 1 is a positive. Opposites tell me to add. 7 plus 5 gives me an answer of 12. I would like you to do 9 and 10, and then we'll check your work. So if you aren't finished with those two, go ahead and pause the video until you're done, and then restart it. So on number 9, hopefully you saw that my x-axis is the same. So my y is the one that I'm going to do my work with. I find my absolute value of negative 6, which is 6. And my absolute value of negative 10, which was 10. But then you notice they're on the same side because we have the same sign. They're both negatives, so I'm going to subtract. I can't take that away from each other, so I'm going to stack them in reverse order. And 10 minus 6 would give me 4. And then when I do number 10, I see that my x-axis is also the one that stays the same. So my y-axis is the one I'll do the math with. My absolute value of 0, well, that's kind of tricky because there really isn't an absolute value of 0. It just stays as 0. My absolute value of negative 8 is a positive 8. So are they on the same side? Well, that was a little tricky, how you look at it. I could say, well, we're going to say they're on opposite sides. Okay, so I would have opposite sides. I would add them together, and therefore 0 plus 8 would give me 8. But maybe you looked at it as if they're on the same side. Well, if you said, well, they're on the same side, and I had 0 minus 8, which I can't do, well, I'll write it as 8 minus 0. And what do I get? Same answer. So don't let those confuse you. Work through it and see that you would get the same answer either way. Finally, we're going to get down to these bottom 3. Now, these bottom 3 are going to try to trick you a little bit because there's not one exact right answer. If we think about what is being asked, I'll see that I could actually have 2 possible answers on each one of these. So it tells me to find a distance or the coordinates that the x stays the same for the ordered pair of 3, 5, but I'm going 4 units. So I could go in either direction. I could either add to my y 4 steps, or I could take away 4 steps. So you could get either a 3 positive 9, or also acceptable, you could get a 3 positive 1, because I could take 4 steps away. Same thing with number 12. But this time, I'm going to go 6 units with my x-axis. So I could go forward, excuse me, not 8, but 6. Or I could go backwards. So when I'm doing those then, and I think about what I'm doing, if I go forward from 2 and I add 6, well then I would have a positive 8, 1. But if I go backwards, that's where my number line would help me. Because if I go from positive 2 and I go backwards 6, that takes me 1, 2, and I get to 0. And then 4 more backwards gives me a -4. So I could also have the ordered pair of -4, +1. You do number 13, see what you get. So if you're still working, go ahead and pause the video and then restart. If not, then you could have had 2 possible answers. Angle my camera down. In my 2 possible answers, my x is going to stay the same, so I could add or go forward 7 steps, or I could subtract or go back 7 steps. Well, if I go forward 7 steps from a -1, that would take me to a +6. So my ordered pair could be -4, +6. If I'm going backwards from -1, 7 steps, then I would go all the way to a -8. So my ordered pair could also be -4, -8. 2 possible answers, I will accept either one. Depends on which way you look at it. So work through the problems that are going to be on my board as your homework. If you have any questions while you're working, please come to the back of the room and ask.